A woman who suspected she might be pregnant was instructed to insert a peeled onion or, sometimes a clove of garlic into herself overnight. In the morning, the physician, or worse, her husband, would check her breath. Aha! If her breath smelled of onion, the hat was beautifully deranged. They believed the womb was not just a reproductive organ, but a literal tunnel connecting the mouth and the nether regions, a kind of biological hallway that apparently doubled as an air vent. It was the medieval equivalent of saying, if you can smell it upstairs, the basement's fine. Some doctors even claimed to detect conception based on how much the onion smell traveled, ranking women on a scale of freshly scented to sealed by God's will. Medieval people, to their credit, never ran out of confidence, just dignity. What makes this worse is that it kind of made sense to them. Ancient texts describe the womb as a living creature, temperamental, mobile, and capable of wandering around the body if neglected. A wandering womb could cause hysteria, fainting, or, apparently, onion-free breath. The cure? Fragrance therapy. Bring the womb back into position with pleasant smells near the pelvis and foul ones near the nose. Medicine at its most interpretive. One has to imagine the poor women involved, trying to keep a straight face while a man with bad Latin pronounced her sealed with mystery. For some, the test might have been mildly humiliating. For others, terrifying. But for physicians, it was just another day at work diagnosing life through vegetables. So yes, in the Grand Museum of Medieval Medicine, the onion test deserves its own exhibit, preferably far from the air conditioning. By the late Middle Ages, the onion test had evolved or, depending on how you see it, mutated into a new and improved version, the garlic breath test. Because if there's one thing humanity excels at, it's doubling down on a bad idea and making it smell worse. The method was nearly identical. Take a clove of garlic, insert it somewhere garlic doesn't belong, and wait overnight. In the morning, a trained professional and, I am using that term as generously as possible, would lean in close and check for the scent on the woman's breath. If it wafted upward, the body was open, and therefore not pregnant. If there was no trace of garlic, congratulations, you were expecting, and probably never kissing your husband again. The reasoning was, as usual, delightfully insane. Medieval physicians believed that air traveled freely through a woman's body, connecting the mouth, lungs, heart, and womb in one big continuous hallway. The garlic test, then, was a kind of plumbing inspection. If the vapors of the garlic reached the mouth, everything was open. If not, something or someone was blocking the pipeline. It's equal parts superstition and early anatomy lesson. After all, they were trying to understand the body with zero technology and a working model that might as well have been drawn by a toddler with a crayon. And yet they wrote about it with absolute authority. One physician claimed, "The scent, if passing unimpeded, showeth the womb to be void." Translation: I have no idea how this works, but I'm sure it's profound. This wasn't some obscure village ritual either. It was recorded in medical texts and passed down for centuries. Even Renaissance doctors, those self-proclaimed men of science, kept the garlic theory alive. Apparently, progress smells like lunch. Of course, not every doctor used garlic. Some preferred onions, leeks, or even rose petals for gentler results. Which means that medieval Europe was a place where you could walk into a physician's office and be prescribed a salad. At some point, medieval medicine decided that if plants and produce couldn't provide answers, maybe metal could. Thus was born the metal reaction test, a dignified experiment that involved once again urine. Because apparently no one in the Middle Ages ever got tired of examining it under new lighting conditions. The process was simple. Collect the suspect's urine. Pour it onto a piece of metal lead tin, or occasionally bronze, and wait. If the metal darkened, corroded, or changed color, the woman was declared pregnant. If nothing happened, she wasn't. And if the metal started smoking, well, that was a sign from God, and also possibly lead poisoning. The reasoning was that pregnancy altered the purity of a woman's fluids, and metals, being noble elements, would instinctively react to this sacred change. It was chemistry before chemistry. Womb was said to be open, meaning no pregnancy. For breath remained neutral, the womb was closed, meaning a baby was on the way. The logic, if you can call it there, is the punctuated script with no changes to the words, only adding appropriate punctuation. Hey guys, tonight we begin with the strange, uncomfortable, and occasionally horrifying world of medieval medicine. A world where diagnosing pregnancy involved more superstition than science. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. We turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's unsettling little journey together. If you think modern medicine can be confusing, imagine living in a world where health meant keeping your four bodily fluids in emotional harmony. Medieval Europe believed everyone was a walking soup: blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile. If any ingredient got moody, congratulations, you were dying, possessed, or both. Doctors at the time had no microscopes, no understanding of germs, and only a passing relationship with hygiene. Their main qualification was a robe, some Latin, and a terrifying amount of confidence. They diagnosed everything: gout, heartbreak, demonic influence by holding your wrist and pretending to feel destiny. Pregnancy, of course, was just another mystery to be solved by creative improvisation and someone else's bodily fluids. When a woman suspected she might be pregnant, the local physician, a word that here means guy who owns jars, would arrive like an oracle. He'd ask a few serious questions, squint at her color, and declare he needed a sample. That meant urine, because medieval medicine always came back to pee. To them, urine was the body's autobiography: color, smell, texture, and the occasional omen. If it looked lively, pregnancy. If it looked melancholic, not pregnant. If it contained frogs, probably witchcraft. Most medieval doctors operated under the guiding principle of why not. The theory sounded mystical enough, it was good science. They genuinely believed the womb was a wandering creature that roamed around inside a woman's body, causing mood swings. One 14th century text even advised enticing the womb back to its place with pleasant aromas, which raises serious questions about what counted as pleasant. Still, we can't be too hard on them. They were working blind in a world with no microscopes, no hormones, and no understanding of how anything worked besides bread. What they lacked in accuracy, they made up for in flair. And confidence was apparently half the cure. Of all the bizarre pregnancy tests in medieval Europe, none was more popular or more agricultural than the wheat and barley test. It was simple, cheap, and perfectly disgusting. The woman would urinate on two small piles of grain, one wheat and one barley, and then everyone would wait a few days. If either pile sprouted, she was declared pregnant. If both sprouted, even better. The midwife would announce twins or divine that the baby would be blessed. If neither sprouted, she was either barren, cursed, or just dehydrated. According to 14th century medical texts, barley sprouting first meant the baby would be a boy and wheat meant a girl. So in theory, the plant kingdom was not only confirming conception, but doing gender reveals long before balloons and explosions. It's oddly poetic. Life detecting life. And then everyone standing around staring at damp cereal. The logic, while absurd, had a kind of medieval elegance. People genuinely believed that a pregnant woman's urine carried the essence of new life, sort of magical fertility vapor that could wake seeds from their sleep. It was biology by metaphor. The womb gives, the grain responds, everyone claps. The fact that it occasionally worked only made things worse. Modern science has actually tested this ancient method and against all odds found a grain of truth. Elevated levels of estrogen in pregnancy can slightly accelerate germination. In other words, it might work, but only if you ignore the part where people kept jars of urine in their kitchens for a week and called it divine revelation. Imagine being the husband waiting for results. Darling, the barley's sprouting. Wonderful. Now please throw it away before it develops consciousness. The smell alone could have driven entire villages to prayer. But for medieval Europe, this was cutting-edge diagnostics. Cost nothing, required no literacy, and looked impressively agricultural. Doctors and midwives alike swore by it, and so did countless women who didn't have any better options. If medieval Europe had a motto, it would have been, when in doubt, add wine. It was the solution to everything: infections, heartbreak, social anxiety, and apparently pregnancy testing. This particular method came from the learned physicians of the late Middle Ages, who decided that the best way to detect pregnancy was to mix a woman's urine with wine and wait to see what happened. If the mixture stayed clear, she was pregnant. If it turned cloudy or curdled, she wasn't. Somewhere. The priest was nodding approvingly, because this at least sounded like chemistry. The logic was inspired by the belief that wine's purity reacted only to healthy or divinely charged fluids. Pregnancy, they argued, filled a woman's body with sacred life essence, so her urine wouldn't spoil the wine, which is one way to explain it. The other way is that medieval doctors really liked excuses to drink on the job. The process went like this. A patient provided her sample. The physician poured in a generous splash of red or white, and then everyone just stared at it. The physician would swirl it dramatically, much like a sommelier, comment on the aroma robust, with notes of desperation, and then declare a verdict. If nothing else, it gave the illusion of professionalism. Occasionally, this method may have worked purely by accident. Modern research suggests that alcohol can react with proteins in urine, sometimes revealing changes related to pregnancy. But in medieval Europe, the only consistent reaction was nausea. You could almost hear the physician saying, "It's not science, but it feels scientific." Of course, results varied wildly. Some mixtures fizzed, some curdled, and some simply smelled like regret. The doctor's interpretation depended entirely on how bad the odor was. If it made him wince, it was probably a boy. It's hard not to admire the medieval spirit of curiosity, even if it was paired with catastrophic decision-making. This was an age when urine wasn't just a waste product. It was data, and the doctor's goblet was a laboratory. Of all the tests devised in the medieval world, few are as memorable or as unfortunate as the onion test. It came from ancient Egypt, took a long scenic route through Greece, and finally arrived in medieval Europe, where it was adopted with disturbing enthusiasm. Or, more accurately, before understanding anything about chemistry. The idea that gods' favorite metals could somehow sense the presence of a fetus was both profoundly poetic and profoundly stupid. Naturally, results were inconsistent. Some metals tarnished quickly, others not at all, and occasionally a physician would simply declare it has a sheen most divine and hand the woman a bill. The test's reliability depended entirely on the local humidity and how long the doctor was willing to stare at a pot of pee. In its own strange way, the metal reaction test reflected a growing curiosity about the material world. This was the dawn of alchemy, a time when science and mysticism were still roommates who refused to set boundaries. Everything from mercury to moonlight was believed to hold hidden knowledge. If a stone could turn to gold, surely a woman's urine could reveal a soul in progress. It's easy to laugh, but there's something darkly admirable in their dedication. These people genuinely wanted answers. They just lacked microscopes, thermometers, and the faintest idea of what a uterus actually did. The medieval world loved symbolism. Fire was purity, light was truth, and urine was, well, unavoidable. So naturally, someone decided to combine all three into a single medical masterpiece, the candle test. The world's first attempt at turning pregnancy detection into a seance. The setup was simple, but theatrical. Take a pot of urine, light a candle, and hold it over the container. Then observe. If the flame flickered, the woman was pregnant. If it burned steady, she wasn't. And if it went out completely, there was either no baby or no oxygen. Either way, the test was over. This wasn't just a village trick. It was performed by educated physicians, men with robes, titles, and absolutely no understanding of combustion. They believed that pregnancy released subtle vapors through a woman's body, invisible emanations of new life that would rise up and interact with the flame. If the candle quivered, the womb was stirring with divine activity. If not, maybe next year. Imagine the scene. A medieval doctor hunched over a glowing candle, muttering Latin incantations, while a poor woman sits in silence, watching her bodily fluids heat gently in a brass pot. It's the kind of moment that makes you grateful to be born after the invention of the laboratory. In theory, it made poetic sense. Light revealing life, fire answering flesh. In practice, it was nonsense. The test results depended entirely on drafts, humidity, and how long it took the physician to get bored. Many women were likely declared pregnant with great certainty just because someone opened a window. But to the medieval mind, the flicker of a flame carried divine authority. Science and mysticism were still on speaking terms, and everything mysterious was automatically sacred. To them, pregnancy wasn't a biological event. It was a cosmic one. If a candle danced, it wasn't physics. It was the soul making its debut performance. Of all the pregnancy tests devised in medieval Europe, few were as mystical or as physically uncomfortable as the key and the dream method. It was half science, half witchcraft, and 100% nonsense. Here's how it worked. A woman who suspected she might be pregnant would sleep with a metal key placed under her pillow. The next morning, she'd report her dreams. If she dreamed of children, fertility, or light, congratulations, she was pregnant. If she dreamed of demons, storms, or doors that wouldn't open, the womb was declared barren. Essentially, it was Freud, but with more iron. Some variations went further. In certain regions of France and Italy, the key wasn't under the pillow. It was tied to the thigh or placed on the stomach, close to the source of life, because nothing says restful sleep like being mildly stabbed by your own diagnostic tool. The idea was rooted in medieval symbolism. Keys represented unlocking of doors, mysteries, and, in this case, wombs. The logic was that if a key was close enough to a sleeping woman, her dreams would reveal what the body concealed. The mind and the womb, they said, were sisters in secrecy. Which sounds poetic until you remember it was written by men who thought sneezing could cause miscarriage. For many women, this was one of the less humiliating methods. No onions, no jars of urine, no candles over steaming pots, just a key. A night's rest, and a morning full of vague dream analysis. The downside was that dreams are notoriously uncooperative. I dreamed of a goose stealing bread could be interpreted as either you re-expecting twins or the devil involved. Naturally, every physician swore by his own version of dream interpretation. One claimed that dreaming of water meant pregnancy, while another said the same dream meant digestive issues. The key in the dream test reveals a lot about the medieval mindset, a world desperate to find order in chaos, to turn mystery into metaphor. And if the method didn't work, well, they could always blame the key for being rusty. For a civilization obsessed with fluids, it was only a matter of time before medieval doctors moved on from urine and decided, let's see what the blood says. Thus emerged one of the more dramatic and unhygienic pregnancy tests of the era, the blood drop omen. The procedure began, as all good medieval medical experiences did, with a sharp object and misplaced confidence. The physician would prick the woman's arm, collect a few drops of blood, and drip them into a bowl of water. Then everyone leaned in to watch, because in an age without Netflix, this was premium entertainment. If the blood spread gracefully through the water, it meant pregnancy. If it clumped, a girl. If it sank, despair. If it floated, congratulations. The doctor would likely claim divine confirmation and charge extra. It was medicine meets tea leaf reading, except with more anemia. The logic, once again, was poetic nonsense. Physicians believed that pregnancy purified the mother's blood, making it lighter, more heavenly. Blood that sank, on the other hand, was thought to be tainted by sin, melancholy, or last night's dinner. In short, your entire reproductive fate could hinge on whether your doctor sneezed near a water bowl. Sometimes, of course, the test went wrong. The blood behaved unpredictably, as blood tends to do, and doctors were forced to improvise. Some blamed evil spirits. Others accused the patient of lying. One even claimed the blood was shy. Truly the scientific method at work, and yet the ritual had gravitas. There was something sacred about blood, life's red signature. To watch a dance in water was, in their eyes, to glimpse creation itself. It was messy, yes, but so was childbirth. Yet to them, it all fit together somehow. Still, one can only imagine the poor women who sat through this process, bleeding into bowls, while a robed man squinted at the results and murmured, "Ah, yes," it was very buoyant. If you were a medieval woman and managed to escape the jars, onions, garlic, and bloodletting, there was still one more diagnostic gauntlet waiting for you. The eye test. No tools, no herbs, no incantations, just a man staring directly into your face until one of you blinked. According to the medical texts of the 13th and 14th centuries, pregnancy could be detected by simply observing the eyes. In the first months, one scholar wrote confidently, her gaze softens, her pupils grow dim, and there is a sparkle of moisture. Another claimed the veins in a woman's eyes grow red and dancing. Third added, rather ominously, that her eyes shine with the secret fire of creation. which sounds poetic until you realize it's just medieval for she looks tired. The logic was fairly straightforward if you were from the 1200s and had never seen biology before. Physicians believed the eyes were mirrors of the soul. Since a pregnant woman carried a second soul within her, her eyes must therefore reflect too. Simple math also wrong. In practice, the test involved a lot of intense staring. Picture a bearded doctor leaning close, peering into your face with candlelight flickering between you, muttering something about divine moisture. Most women probably felt less examined and more haunted. And yet somehow, this passed for medicine. The test was particularly popular with educated doctors, the kind who wore silk hoods, charged obscene amounts, quoted Aristotle incorrectly. For them, staring into a patient's eyes was preferable to dealing with her actual body, which, as everyone knew, was terrifying and full of mysteries. It also had a kind of social convenience. No awkward undressing, no urine jars, no garlic. Just look here, madam, followed by a long pause and a solemn declaration like, "Yes, I see the spark of motherhood." Translation, "I've stared long enough. Please pay me." So yes, the eye test may have been one of the least invasive pregnancy methods of the Middle Ages. But it was also the creepiest job description ever written. Professional eye contact specialist, part-time prophet. While the men of medicine were busy brewing potions, lighting candles over pots of urine, and pretending to understand Latin, the real experts of pregnancy were already hard at work, the midwives. These women didn't need onions, barley, or blood bowls. They had something far more powerful: experience, observation, and an unshakable sense of when someone was lying about just being bloated. Medieval midwives had seen it all. They were the unsung field researchers of an age that didn't believe in data, but loved gossip. While doctors wrote theories about the essence of life, midwives were the ones catching it, usually while standing in a smoky cottage, elbows deep in someone else's miracle. Their pregnancy tests were simple and far more reliable than anything the universities came up with. They felt a woman's pulse, noted her skin tone, studied her walk, and paid attention to things like cravings and fatigue. They could often detect pregnancy weeks before any doctor's candle flickered or barley sprouted. And they didn't need to wave garlic around to do it. Of course, their accuracy made them suspicious. Men in authority were baffled by the idea that someone without a beard could know things they didn't. The church often accused midwives of witchcraft because, clearly, anyone that competent must be in league with Satan. One midwife was even recorded as saying, "Damn, the womb tells me what the woman cannot." For a 14th century cleric, that was basically a confession of sorcery. Yet, despite persecution, these women persisted. They treated generations of mothers, often for free or for payment in bread. They relied on intuition, a sharp eye, and centuries of oral tradition passed from woman to woman, and they were usually right. Ironically, the midwives, not the scholars or priests, represented the first real science of pregnancy: observation, pattern recognition, and practical knowledge, all the things the universities refused to admit mattered. By the late Middle Ages, analyzing urine had become a full-fledged profession, not a side hobby, not an unfortunate Tuesday, but an actual career path. The practitioners were known as uroscopists, and they were the rock stars of medieval diagnostics. These men strutted through towns in velvet robes, carrying crystal flasks filled with other people's bodily fluids, and somehow managed to convince everyone this was respectable. Their entire medical method revolved around one sacred object: the flask of urine, also known as the metulla. This was usually held up to the light, swirled like fine wine, and examined for color, clarity, bubbles, and occasionally omens. If the urine was pale yellow, all was well. If it was reddish, fever. If it was cloudy, pregnancy. And if it was black, well, your soul was already halfway out the door. Uroscopists even published urine color charts, elaborate wheels showing 40 shades of yellow that made them look like medieval interior designers. They'd point solemnly to a segment labeled hopeful gold or sorrowful brown, pretending. The human bladder was a paint sample from Divine Home Depot. What's even more impressive is how portable their expertise was. A wealthy patron didn't even have to meet the doctor. You could send your urine by courier. Yes, mail-order medicine in the 1300s. And the uroscopist would send back a handwritten scroll diagnosing your condition. No follow-up questions, no refund policy. This was serious business. Some doctors claimed they could tell not only if a woman was pregnant, but what kind of child she carried, cheerful, strong, or melancholic, because apparently urine had personality. Of course, the profession attracted its fair share of frauds. Some men bought second-hand degrees, some memorized colors, and some simply nodded wisely no matter what they saw. Your urine, they'd say, shows great complexity, which was medieval, for I have no idea. And yet people trusted them. In a world without labs, the medulla was the closest thing to a microscope, an early attempt to read the body through what it discarded. Crude, yes, gross, definitely. But in its own way, it was the Middle Ages trying with all its sincerity and superstition to look inside itself, one flask at a time. It was only a matter of time before the church noticed what was going on. People boiling urine under candles, sleeping on keys, and stuffing onions into places that weren't designed for produce. In a world where God was supposedly in charge of everything, the church didn't appreciate amateurs running their own biology experiments. Clerics began calling these pregnancy tests vain curiosities. That was medieval code for your meddling in God's business. After all, only divine will was supposed to reveal life in the womb. Its attempt to confirm it yourself, especially using garlic, was seen as pride, or worse, sorcery. Because, clearly Satan's greatest plan for humanity was teaching women to identify a missed period. Pregnancy, in the church's view, was a sacred mystery. The Virgin Mary had set the bar extremely high, and the clergy was about to let the average woman's anatomy turn into a public guessing game. So priests condemned many of these methods, particularly the ones that looked too ritualistic: wine and urine, possibly witchcraft, sprouting barley, pagan candle tests. Definitely heresy with better lighting. Of course, medieval Europe being medieval Europe, the prohibition only made the tests more popular. The church's disapproval gave them a whiff of forbidden knowledge, which for some women was better than another lecture about chastity. Midwives, already under suspicion for knowing too much, continued their work in secret, caught between religion and reason. It wasn't that the church opposed all forms of medicine. They just didn't like any process that allowed people to skip the priestly middleman. If you were sick, you confessed. If you were dying, you confessed faster. But pregnancy? That required no sin, no confession, and therefore no revenue. It was the ultimate theological loophole. In a way, the church wasn't entirely wrong. These tests were unscientific, messy, and often dangerous. But in suppressing them, it also delayed the pursuit of actual understanding. The result was a strange equilibrium. The faithful praying for signs from heaven, while the curious still stared into bowls of urine, hoping to see life reflected back. For a millennium, that was medicine's awkward truce with theology, half faith, half fumes, and entirely human. Every now and then, amid the chaos of medieval medicine, something almost miraculous happened, a superstition that, against all odds, kind of worked. Not because anyone understood why, but because even a broken worldview gets one right occasionally. Take the wheat and barley test. Remember the one where women peed on seeds to see if they sprouted? Modern scientists actually revisited it and found a faint glimmer of truth. Estrogen in pregnant women's urine can stimulate seed germination, meaning that, without knowing it, medieval peasants stumbled upon an early form of biological assay centuries before laboratories or microscopes. In other words, they invented pregnancy testing by accident, and then immediately buried it under garlic and theology. Even the wine test, that strange medieval cocktail of bodily fluids and fermented grapes, had an unexpected scientific core. Alcohol does react with certain proteins and hormones present in urine during pregnancy. Of course, it was never precise, but it worked just enough to convince everyone to keep trying it, and possibly to justify drinking on the job. It's a recurring theme in history: blind superstition, tripping over actual science. The medievals were surrounded by clues, physical, chemical, biological, but without the tools to interpret them, they turned everything into ritual. They were performing experiments. They just didn't know it. Each test was part medicine, part magic trick, part faith. You have to admire the persistence. If something seemed to work twice, it was holy truth. If it failed, it was the devil's interference. Peer review consisted of shouting Latin louder than everyone else. And yet, somehow, through the noise, tiny sparks of truth survived. This strange overlap between belief and biology gave birth to centuries of medical innovation. It taught Europe that the human body could be studied, even if the conclusions were usually wrong. And, eventually, those curiosities, the jars, the seeds, the wine evolved into chemistry, anatomy, and early pharmacology. By the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe had finally started to realize that maybe, just maybe, sniffing garlic breath and boiling urine weren't the foundations of modern science. But progress in the Middle Ages was never a clean transition. It was more of a sticky shuffle forward, like someone trying to cross a muddy field while holding a candle and a theory. The old tests didn't disappear overnight. The barley jars, the blood bowls, and the urine flasks still lingered in remote villages, long after scholars began rediscovering Greek anatomy and inconveniently human logic. Even as the universities of Paris and Bologna bloomed with new learning, midwives were still quietly sprouting grains in kitchen corners. What changed was the attitude. Curiosity stopped being suspicious. People began to ask why instead of who cursed me. Alchemists evolved into chemists, herbalists into pharmacists, and the wandering womb was finally given a permanent address. The human body stopped being a divine mystery and became a puzzle still complicated, still disgusting, but at least one you could study without a priest breathing down your neck. By the 19th century, science finally caught up to what superstition had been clumsily hinting at all along. The first reliable pregnancy test used animal urine and hormones, an eerily sophisticated descendant of the barley jar except with lab coats instead of aprons. By the mid-20th century, the little white plastic stick arrived, discreet, clinical, and mercifully free of onions. Yet for all the centuries of progress, the core ritual hasn't changed. You still urinate on something and wait for it to tell you your future. The difference is that now it's sanitary, private, and blessedly free of candlelight and theological commentary. Looking back, it's tempting to mock the medieval world for its absurdity. But there's something stubbornly human in it, too. They were guessing, experimenting, hoping, just with worse lighting and no soap. Their failures paved the road we now walk with sterile hands. In the heart of Egypt's royal palaces, beyond the towering pylons and the scent of lotus gardens, lay a world the public would never glimpse. The royal harem Pernafare, the house of the secluded, was a place wrapped in mystery and myth. It was not simply a den of pleasure, as foreign chroniclers would later imagine, but a realm of education, politics, and quiet ambition. Within its scented chambers lived the wives, concubines, and daughters of the pharaoh, guarded by eunuchs and trusted officials who ensured no uninvited soul dared to cross the threshold. For the women inside, the harem was both paradise and prison. Silk and gold surrounded them, but so did rules, hundreds of them. The corridors echoed not with laughter, but with whispers, each one a seed of intrigue. The great royal wife, often the pharaoh's equal in status and ceremony, presided over this inner world like a queen within a kingdom. Beneath her were noble-born ladies, foreign princesses offered as tokens of alliance, and servants trained in grace, music, and obedience. Education was not neglected here. The daughters of Egypt's elite learned to write hieroglyphs, recite poetry, play the harp, and master the art of diplomacy. Every gesture mattered, for one wrong look or careless word could destroy a future. A favored concubine might rise to influence, bearing a prince whose bloodline could one day claim the throne. Another might vanish overnight, erased by jealousy or rumor. The walls of the harem concealed more than beauty. They hid ambition sharper than any blade. Behind closed doors, alliances were formed, and secrets traded like gold. Couriers whispered through silk screens, carrying messages that could sway ministers or topple viziers. When the pharaoh fell ill or old, the harem became the battlefield of succession. Every woman with a son saw a crown in her dreams, and every servant carried knowledge worth killing for. To the people beyond the palace gates, the harem was a legend, a place of forbidden allure. But for those inside, it was a game of survival, where perfume masked fear and affection could be fatal. Beneath its painted ceilings, Egypt's most intimate power struggles began not on the battlefield, but in the dark, perfumed silence behind the curtains. Every pharaoh's harem reflected his reign, his power, his vanity, his fears. Desire and diplomacy intertwined in ways even the gods might envy. The women who filled these gilded chambers were not merely ornaments. They were instruments of policy, chosen with care from noble families and foreign courts alike. To marry or bear a princess from Babylon, Nubia, or Hatti meant forging alliances that reached far beyond the Nile. Yet, within the harem walls, these foreign women found themselves caught between reverence and resentment. They were symbols of Egypt's dominance, but also reminders of its vulnerability. At the top stood the great royal wife, the true queen of Egypt, often worshipped beside her husband as divine consort. She wielded authority not just in ceremony, but in council, sometimes acting as regent when the pharaoh was away or dead. Queens like Nefertari and Tai proved that the harem could produce partners in power, not just concubines of pleasure. Their portraits on temple walls were more than art. They were propaganda, proclaiming to all that Egypt's stability began in the royal bedchamber. Below the queen, a delicate hierarchy ruled. Each concubine's value depended on her favor with the king and the birth of a son. Servants moved silently between silk partitions, bringing perfumes from Punt and honeyed figs from Thebes, while eunuchs maintained order with an almost religious devotion. The harem functioned like a small city, self-contained and heavily guarded. Even the architecture reinforced control. Labyrinthine halls ensured no outsider could enter and no insider could easily escape. But desire in a palace of gods was dangerous. Every touch carried political weight. A single night's favor could change destinies. Forgotten lover could become a viper. The pharaoh's heart was an empire in miniature, rival kingdoms of affection rising and falling with every passing whim. The women knew this, and they played their roles with exquisite precision. Some relied on beauty, others on intellect, a few on cunning. In these perfumed rooms, politics wore the mask of passion. A well-timed smile could secure a throne for a son unborn. And while the men of Egypt built pyramids to honor their gods, it was the women behind veiled doors who built the legacies of kings. One whispered secret, one stolen night at a time. Life within the harem was not a simple indulgence in perfumes and silk. It was a system, structured, meticulous, and deeply symbolic. From the moment a girl entered the harem, her world shifted from the dust of the outer city to the fragrance of incense, the rustle of linen, and the silent discipline of ritual. Here knowledge was a weapon, and the wise survived longer than the merely beautiful. Young women of noble or royal birth were educated by priestesses, scribes, and musicians in the art of refinement. They learned to read the sacred texts, to pour wine without spilling a drop, and to sing hymns that pleased both gods and men. Their voices echoed through painted corridors, each note designed to soothe or seduce. Beauty was rehearsed as if it were religion, hair braided with lapis and gold, skin anointed with oils from Nubia, eyes darkened with kohl to mirror the horizon at dusk. But beneath the cosmetics and ceremony lay something sharper. The understanding that charm could command armies, and a glance could unmake alliances. Philosophy, history, and politics often followed the lessons of dance and music. The most trusted tutors taught their pupils how to read faces, how to listen between words, how to remember every small secret shared in passing. The daughters of pharaohs were schooled not just in elegance but in espionage, learning that the fate of Egypt could hinge upon a whisper behind a curtain. Many of these women were prepared for roles beyond pleasure. Some would become priestesses of Hathor, goddess of love and joy. Others would be sent as brides to foreign rulers, bearing both beauty and information. But those who remained within the royal walls grew into silent strategists, masters of influence in a world that pretended they had none. And through it all, they learned to mask emotion with grace. A jealous heart could be fatal. A careless confession, ruinous. The harem was an academy of subtlety, where smiles hid schemes and laughter disguised fear. In this school of silks and shadows, women learned how to wield power without ever appearing to hold it, and how to survive in a world that worshipped them one day and condemned them the next. No war was bloodier than the one fought behind the harem's closed doors. There were no swords or spears, only words sharpened like daggers, glances that could kill reputations, and gifts that carried poison. The royal harem was a battlefield disguised in silk, where alliances shifted with the wind, and enemies smiled over shared cups of date wine. Every woman inside the harem understood the unspoken law. Proximity to the pharaoh meant survival. A single look from him could turn a slave into a queen, or a queen into a memory. Jealousy festered beneath the perfume and laughter. The great royal wife fought not only to keep her husband's favor, but to protect her. Children as future from rivals eager to see their own sons crowned. Servants carried rumors. Here is the script with punctuation added, without changing any words, as if they were jewels, traded and sold in whispers, each one capable of igniting chaos. In this intricate hierarchy, beauty was only half the battle. Charm and manipulation ruled where strength could not. Women bribed eunuchs for information, sent coded messages through embroidered gifts, and performed rituals to win divine favor. The Temple of Hathor, patroness of love, received endless offerings from anxious hearts seeking an advantage in the eternal contest for affection. But even victory came with danger. Favored concubines' triumph could end as swiftly as it began. A rival might slip venom into her ointment jar, or spread tales of witchcraft to discredit her name. The pharaoh, ever surrounded by divers and spies, could turn cold overnight, leaving yesterday's darling in chains or exile. Foreign princesses, far from home and stripped of power, often became pawns in these games. Their only defense was cunning diplomacy, befriending scribes, gaining allies among guards, or appealing directly to the queen's vanity. In the harem's politics, mercy was rare and victory fleeting. Each morning the harem awoke in uneasy peace. Kohl applied, faces painted into masks of serenity, while hearts plotted in silence. The air smelled of jasmine and fear. And though the world outside saw the harem as a paradise of pleasure, those within knew better. It was a kingdom of rivalry where the sweetest smile could hide the cruelest intent. And survival depended not on beauty, but on the ability to play the game without ever losing composure. In the harem, poison was more common than perfume. Death rarely came from a blade. It came from a goblet, a vial, a whisper. Behind the veils of luxury, the harem was also a court of spies and silent killers. Every woman, every servant, every eunuch knew that life could end with a sip of wine or the scent of a flower. The line between survival and execution was as thin as a silk thread. Pharaohs trusted no one completely, not even those who shared their bed. Intrigues brewed faster than incense smoke. One woman's gain meant another's downfall, and ambition often turned lethal. There were no witnesses, no trials, only rumors that vanished into the night. She died of fever, the healers would say the gods took her. But everyone in the palace knew the truth. The gods were not to blame. During the New Kingdom, entire plots unfolded within these secret quarters. A group of royal women, jealous and desperate, once conspired to murder the pharaoh himself. The harem conspiracy under Ramses III became a legend of treachery. One concubine, Tai and her allies, sought to replace the rightful heir with her own son. They bribed guards, seduced scribes, and smuggled magical scrolls meant to paralyze the king. When the plot failed, the conspirators faced grim punishment. Executions carried out in silence, names chiseled out from memory, but the message endured. Even kings could bleed in the harem's shadow. Servants were often forced to choose between loyalty and survival. A careless word could cost a life. A useful secret could buy freedom. Eunuchs trusted as neutral guardians became the unseen watchers of empire. They reported whispers, recorded meetings, and sometimes ended them. Every step in the harem was political theater. Glance a bow, an offering. All could be a signal. Those who mastered deception thrived. Those who hesitated disappeared. The harem, in truth, was a miniature court of Egypt itself, filled with divine ceremony, yet governed by mortal fear. Behind the sweet music of harps and the gentle rustle of linen, the air was heavy with tension. The women of the harem smiled as they danced for the gods, but in their eyes flickered the knowledge that one false move, one misplaced trust, could end not just a life, but a dynasty. Every empire needs its guardians. In Egypt's royal harems, those guardians were the eunuchs, the watchers who saw everything and spoke of nothing. They were both invisible and indispensable, the silent machinery that kept the harem's delicate order intact. Castrated in youth and sworn to eternal service, they were trusted precisely because they could not father children, and thus posed no threat to royal bloodlines. Yet in truth, they wielded more power than many ministers of state. The eunuchs controlled access to the women, guarded the gates, carried the messages, and served as the eyes and ears of the pharaoh himself. They knew who whispered to whom, which gifts carried hidden meanings, and which tears were real or rehearsed. A single eunuch could make or destroy reputations simply by allowing or denying an audience. In a world ruled by secrecy, they were the masters of silence. Though their bodies had been sacrificed to service, many eunuchs compensated with intellect and cunning. They studied languages, politics, and theology, becoming indispensable intermediaries between the harem and the outer court. Some rose to positions of immense influence, advising queens, and even shaping matters of succession. The harem might have been governed by beauty and charm, but it was administered by men who had neither, and that paradox made them formidable. Life for them was a strange mixture of privilege and exile. They dined well, wore fine linen, and spoke directly to royalty. Yet they remained outcasts, neither fully male nor accepted as equals by courtiers. In the palace hierarchy, they were both revered and pitied, symbols of absolute loyalty purchased at a terrible price. At night, when the palace quieted and the women's laughter faded into the walls, the eunuchs remained alert. They checked the corridors, sealed the doors, and reported any unusual sound. It was they who found the poisoned goblet before it reached the queen's lips, or intercepted the letter meant for a rival's destruction. Their vigilance kept Egypt's royal blood safe, or at least alive for another day. The eunuchs of Egypt were more than guards. They were witnesses to history's most secret moments. While pharaohs were immortalized in stone and queens in legend, these watchers of secrets faded into anonymity. Yet without them, the empire's golden silence would have long ago shattered. To outsiders, the royal harem gleamed like paradise, a realm of music, silk, and eternal pleasure. But to many who lived within its high stone walls, it was a prison carved from gold. The women of the harem possessed luxury beyond imagination. Yet freedom was the one treasure denied to them. The same walls that protected their virtue also confined their souls. No woman could leave without permission. Visits from family were rare, and only the most trusted attendants or eunuchs could escort them beyond the gates. The Nile shimmered just beyond sight, tantalizingly close, yet forever out of reach. Even the gardens, lush with papyrus and lotus ponds, were enclosed. Miniature Edens that served as reminders of the vast world they no longer belonged to. Daily life followed strict routine. At dawn, attendants brought scented water for bathing, while musicians played soft hymns to Hathor, goddess of love. The women dressed in fine linen, dined on figs, honey, and wine, and filled the hours with embroidery, poetry, or idle gossip. Not yet beneath the elegance, monotony gnawed at their spirits. The pharaoh's absence could stretch for weeks or months, and boredom often turned to rivalry, envy, or madness. Some women sought solace in religion, praying to Isis for protection, or to Bastet for fertility. Others found comfort in forbidden friendships, small rebellions against a system that prized them for their beauty, but denied them purpose. There were tales of concubines who disguised themselves as servants just to walk in the streets again, only to be caught and never seen afterward. For those who once held power, foreign princesses, noble-born daughters, the confinement was especially cruel. They had been raised to rule courts, not to fade behind curtains. Some turned their intelligence toward survival, keeping journals, studying theology, or training their sons to become heirs. The harem walls could not confine ambition. They only made it quieter. And yet, in this prison of gold, a strange resilience thrived. The women learned to adapt, to find meaning in the smallest freedoms. A secret letter, a shared smile, a glimpse of the sunset through lattice screens. The harem was both sanctuary and cage, where beauty bloomed in captivity and dreams refused to die, even under the watchful eyes of gods and kings. When the pharaoh died, the palace fell silent, but the harem did not. In those tense, uncertain days, another power began to move beneath the surface, the Queen Mother. She was no longer the king's wife, but the mother of the next one, and that made her the most dangerous woman in Egypt. The title of Mut, Mother of the King, carried divine weight. Once her son ascended the throne, her influence surpassed that of any priest or general. She had raised the living God. Her word could shape his will. The harem that once confined her became her court. The women who had once been rivals now bowed before her, hoping for favor. Even viziers lowered their eyes when she passed. The queen mother's quarters became a second palace, where politics were wrapped in incense and ritual. She advised her son on alliances, temple endowments, and succession laws. It was she who chose which half-brothers and concubine-born princes were worthy of command, and which would quietly vanish into priesthood or exile. Her subtle hand could preserve dynasties or extinguish them. History remembers women like Queen Tai, mother of Akhenaten, who steered Egypt's radical transformation of religion and art. Tai corresponded with foreign rulers, negotiated treaties, and appeared beside her son in state reliefs, an honor few women ever achieved. She proved that the Queen Mother was not a relic of domesticity, but the hidden architect of empire. Others were less fortunate. Some Queen Mothers became prisoners of their sons' paranoia, accused of witchcraft or treason once their influence grew too visible. A mother who had helped her child seize the throne could just as easily be blamed for his failures. Power in Egypt was cyclical. It elevated, then devoured. Yet for every downfall, another rose. The Queen Mother endured because she understood the harem's greatest secret, that control was never about strength, but about timing, silence, and memory. She had seen queens rise and fall, concubines poison each other, and ministers beg for whispers of her approval. By the time her son's reign matured, she no longer needed to speak to command. Her presence alone carried the weight of law. The harem that once trapped her had become her empire, and from behind its veiled screens, she ruled Egypt, not with the scepter, but with the quiet power of a mother who had survived them all. Every dynasty ends, and with it the shadows that sustained it fade. As Egypt's power waned and foreign dynasties, Persian, Greek, and Roman, claimed the throne, the royal harems began to lose their old mystique. What had once been the pulse of palace intrigue became a relic of a vanished age, its walls echoing with forgotten songs and the soft decay of luxury. The empire's new rulers brought their own customs, their own courts, and their own women, But even they could not resist the harem's spell. It endured, reshaped, and reimagined, the symbol of the pharaoh's divine sensuality that refused to die. The dynastic periods, the harem's influence grew quieter, yet it still pulsed beneath the marble calm. Queens like Cleopatra, the seventh, redefined what it meant to be a woman of power in Egypt. It's no longer confined to secrecy, but wielding beauty, intellect, and politics in the open. She was, in many ways, the final evolution of the harem-esque legacy, the woman who no longer whispered from behind the curtain, but spoke before nations. But long before Cleopatra's rise, the decay had already begun. Corruption seeped through the palace walls. Eunuchs turned from guardians to power brokers, and intrigue lost its purpose. When foreign armies marched through the Delta, the harem's perfumed chambers became quiet tombs of memory. Those who had once shaped empires through whispers watched as foreign generals dictated Egypt's future in public halls. Yet the harem never truly vanished. Its essence survived in myth and memory in the hieroglyphs etched deep within tombs, in the poems that spoke of secret love, and in the cautionary tales told by scribes. Later rulers, from Byzantine to Ottomans, would inherit and reinvent the idea of the harem, blending Egypt's legacy of sensual politics into their own imperial designs. Historians still debate whether Egypt's harems were places of empowerment or imprisonment. Perhaps they were both. Within those walls, women were denied freedom, yet they learned to turn confinement into influence. They ruled without thrones, commanded without titles, and reshaped dynasties with words softer than a sigh. And though the palaces have crumbled and the perfumes have faded, one truth remains eternal. Egypt's royal harems were not merely chambers of pleasure, but crucibles of power, where beauty became strategy, silence became language, and destiny was written behind closed doors. When the Puritans crossed the stormy Atlantic, they claimed to be escaping the sins of Europe, the vanity of kings, the corruption of bishops, the moral rot of city life. Yet the world they built in America was no Eden. It was a crucible forged by fear and faith, where every act was weighed on the scales of salvation. In the fledgling towns of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Virginia, church steeples rose before taverns, and sermons echoed louder than laughter. God was everywhere, and so was the suspicion of the devil. Religion was not merely belief. it was law. Ministers governed not only souls, but behavior, dictating how one dressed, worked, married, and even dreamed. Dissent was treason, and temptation was an enemy hiding in plain sight. Puritan colonies were bound together by strict moral codes, but beneath the sermons of purity, human weakness simmered. Ministers preached chastity but whispered with widows. Elders thundered about virtue while pocketing tithes. Sin was the one thing that needed no immigration papers. It had arrived long before the ships. Church records from the 1600s and 1700s reveal a society obsessed with discipline. Drunkenness, dancing, gossip, and even laughter at the wrong time were punishable offenses. Yet for all their zeal, the Puritans were human, and repression had its consequences. Forbidden desires festered behind closed shutters, and when scandal finally surfaced, it struck with the force of divine wrath. Faith and power were inseparable. A minister's word could ruin reputations, dissolve marriages, and send men to the gallows. But power, once tasted, became intoxicating. In towns like Salem, Hartford, and Boston, religion blurred with politics. Ministers became mayors in all but name, wielding sermons as weapons. The pulpit became a throne, and every rival congregation a battlefield. And amid this suffocating piety, rumors grew. A pastor caught in adultery might blame witchcraft. A rival church might accuse another of harboring Satan's agents. Behind every accusation, there was envy, rivalry, or lust, dressed in holy robes. The God-fearing world of colonial America wasn't just a society of believers, it was a society afraid of its own shadow. The devil, they said, prowled in the wilderness. But more often than not, he wore the face of a neighbor sitting 2 pews away, smiling during prayer. In colonial America, ministers stood as the ultimate moral authorities, men believed to be chosen by God himself to guide the faithful. They were the interpreters of Scripture, the arbiters of salvation, and the voices of divine law. Yet behind the pulpit's solemn dignity, many carried secrets that would have scandalized even the most hardened sinner in the pews. The irony of a preacher caught in sin was irresistible to a community that saw virtue and vice as cosmic warfare. One of the earliest and most notorious cases involved Reverend Henry Smith of Wethersfield, Connecticut. In the 1640s, Smith's fiery sermons against sin stirred fear and awe until whispers began to spread. He was accused of greed, cruelty, and taking liberties with a female servant. His congregation divided, his reputation shattered, and Smith fled into obscurity. His downfall became a warning. When those who spoke for God sinned, the entire community trembled. But Smith was hardly alone. Throughout the colonies, pastors became entangled in moral and financial scandals. Some were caught embezzling church funds or manipulating tithes for personal gain. Others, far worse, were accused of adultery or improper conduct with parishioners who came seeking comfort. Each revelation tore through the fabric of colonial society, exposing the uncomfortable truth that holiness and hypocrisy often shared the same pulpit. These scandals were not just personal tragedies. They were public events. The entire congregation became a courtroom. The sermons turned into trials. Ministers were expected to embody divine perfection. Yet, they were men surrounded by temptations amplified by power. A comforting visit to a grieving widow could turn into a whispered affair. A moment of kindness to a servant girl could become a gateway to ruin. And because the colonies lacked separation between church and state, moral failure was not merely shameful. It was political suicide. In a world where faith ruled every aspect of life, a minister's fall was the devil's triumph. The people saw such scandals as proof that Satan had infiltrated the church itself. Confessions were demanded, punishments were swift, and the cycle of sin and salvation continued. The preachers who once claimed to save souls became examples of corruption, their sermons echoing with the sins they secretly could not escape. Religion in colonial America was not a quiet matter of prayer. It was a war fought with sermons, pamphlets, and public humiliation. Churches were more than houses of worship. They were centers of political power, gossip, and control. Ministers competed for followers the way generals fought for soldiers, and congregations often split into bitter factions over theology, leadership, and money. Every dispute, no matter how small, was framed as a cosmic battle between good and evil. At the heart of these divisions lay pride and ambition. Ministers accused rival preachers of false doctrine, greed, or heresy, often disguising jealousy as zeal. Congregations broke apart, forming new sects that declared themselves the true followers of God. In Boston, the controversy surrounding Anne Hutchinson in the 1630s exposed this religious volatility. Hutchinson, a midwife and spiritual thinker, began teaching that grace came directly from God, not through ministers. For that, she was tried and banished, not just because of her beliefs, but because she threatened male authority in a world ruled by the pulpit. Her exile marked a turning point. Religion was no longer just faith, it was politics. Each new church carried with it the ghost of the last one, resentment, betrayal, and ambition disguised as holiness. Pastors built followings by attacking others, using their sermons to stir fear and loyalty. The more scandalous the accusation, the larger the crowd that gathered on Sunday. Colonial religion thrived on drama, and ministers learned early that outrage filled pews faster than Scripture alone. Disputes over money deepened the divide. Some churches fought over tithes, accusing others of misusing sacred funds to build lavish meeting houses or purchase expensive communion silver. Others quarreled over who held the right to hire or fire clergy, the congregation or the colonial governor. These clashes often ended in public trials that blurred the line between courtroom and church service. In this environment, faith was as much performance as devotion. Congregants judged one another's righteousness like juries, and salvation became a competition. The church, meant to unite, instead fractured the colonies into endless rivalries. And in those rivalries, the whispers of scandal grew louder. For every sermon about heaven, there was a secret argument, a hidden affair, or a prayer muttered in envy. Proof that beneath the hymns and hallelujahs power, not piety, ruled God's house. By the late 17th century, religion and scandal in colonial America had taken on a darker tone. Fear became the most effective sermon. When ministers could no longer keep congregations loyal through faith alone, they turned to the devil. Witchcraft, that ancient shadow, became the perfect explanation for everything that went wrong: failed crops, sudden illness, or moral collapse. And beneath those accusations often lurked politics, jealousy, and revenge. The Salem witch trials of 1692 remain the most infamous example, but the hysteria had deeper roots. Ministers and magistrates saw the devil as a political enemy as much as a spiritual one. Accusing someone of witchcraft wasn't merely a religious statement, it was a weapon. A rival family could be ruined overnight. A critic could be silenced. A woman who questioned authority could be hanged. And all of it could be done in the name of God. Behind the pulpit, preachers like Cotton Mather thundered about invisible demons and divine justice. Yet many historians now see those sermons as political theater. The colonies were unstable, plagued by disease, economic hardship, and conflict with native tribes. In such uncertainty, witchcraft served as both distraction and control. Fear united the flock when faith faltered. The louder the sermons about Satan, the quieter the dissent against ministers themselves. Accusations often began as whispers: a servant girl falling ill, a cow dying mysteriously, a woman muttering after church. But once suspicion took root, it spread like wildfire. Ministers lent credibility to gossip, transforming rumor into revelation. Courts became extensions of the pulpit, and testimony born of hysteria carried the weight of divine truth. Yet the trials also revealed a brutal irony. Those most obsessed with purity were often the ones most corrupted by power. Some ministers used witch hunts to eliminate critics or distract from their own sins. A preacher accused of adultery could regain his moral standing by denouncing a witch. In Salem and beyond, righteousness became a mask for vengeance. When the hysteria finally burned out, it left behind a haunted silence. Ministers who had once preached about the devil now stood accused of unleashing him. And for the first time, colonists began to wonder if evil truly came from witches or from the men who preached against them. In a world built on sermons and sin, few scandals struck harder than adultery, especially when it involved the men who claimed to guard morality itself. Colonial America was a society obsessed with purity, yet constantly entangled in temptation. Behind closed doors, even ministers broke the commandments they thundered from the pulpit. When those affairs surfaced, they didn't just shatter marriages. They shook entire congregations. Public punishments for adultery were severe. In Puritan New England, ordinary citizens caught in infidelity faced whippings, fines, or the infamous scarlet A stitched to their clothing. But when clergy fell from grace, the spectacle turned biblical. Ministers accused of adultery were dragged before their congregations, forced to confess in front of the very people they had once preached to. Yet even humiliation could not cleanse the hypocrisy, for the church often protected its own. Example was Reverend Thomas Hooker's protege, the charismatic preacher Samuel Willard of Boston. Rumors spread that he had taken undue liberties with a married parishioner. The whispers reached the elders, but the church moved carefully. Too many influential families supported him. His sin was quietly forgiven while lesser offenders faced ruin. The scandal revealed an uncomfortable truth. Morality was negotiable when power was involved. Other ministers were not so lucky. In smaller towns, accusations destroyed entire congregations. A preacher's affair could split a church into factions, one side crying for mercy, the other demanding blood. Sermons became battlefields of shame, and every verse about David and Bathsheba sounded uncomfortably close to home. Some preachers caught in guilt fled their parishes. Others doubled down, preaching even harder against lust, hoping louder condemnation would hide private guilt. For women, the cost was far worse. A minister might be forgiven after a tearful confession, but his lover was branded forever. Temptress or Jezebel. She would be cast out of the community while her partner returned to the pulpit. The colonies demanded female purity yet excused male power, a double standard sanctified by scripture and upheld by scandal. In the end, every act of secret desire became a sermon in itself. Colonial America's obsession with righteousness made it blind to its own reflection. Behind every fiery warning of damnation stood a trembling soul, praying not for salvation, but that no one would discover what the preacher did after dark. In colonial America, confession was not a private matter of conscience. It was theater. Religion demanded spectacle. And nowhere was that more evident than in the rituals of public shame. The colonies believed sin had to be purged through humiliation, whether it was adultery, drunkenness, or blasphemy. Every offense against God required a performance before the entire community. The Puritans held purity trials, informal hearings, where neighbors became judges, and gossip became evidence. The accused stood in front of the congregation while ministers cross-examined them in God's name. Tears trembling and apologies were expected. Anything less than complete repentance was proof of demonic pride. Women often wept their way through these trials, heads bowed under linen veils, while men muttered that Eve's curse still lingered in their hearts. Ministers, of course, presided over these spectacles, sometimes the same men who privately carried their own sins. In towns like Ipswich and Salem, the church became a stage of spiritual voyeurism. Sermons would retell the crimes in vivid detail, transforming confession into moral entertainment. The faithful would murmur prayers for the fallen soul and then whisper about them for weeks. Forgiveness was preached from the pulpit but rarely practiced in the streets. Punishment was designed to remind everyone of their place beneath God's eye. Adulterers were paraded through town in coarse linen. Blasphemers were forced to wear wooden tongues as symbols of their wicked speech. In extreme cases, offenders were whipped or branded. The goal wasn't correction, it was fear. Every punishment reinforced the message that salvation depended not only on faith, but on obedience to the social order. Yet these rituals revealed more about control than holiness. Ministers and elders wielded shame like a tool to silence dissent, especially against women or lower-class citizens. A poor widow accused of immodesty could be ruined. A wealthy merchant caught in the same act could repent quietly with a donation to the church. Religion claimed to cleanse, but in practice, it reinforced hierarchy. Over time, even devout colonists began to sense the cruelty beneath the piety. The very faith that promised redemption had become a system of domination where forgiveness was conditional, confession was coerced, and holiness depended not on one's soul, but on one's standing in the community. By the early 18th century, colonial religion had become a mirror, reflecting its own contradictions. Ministers preached purity while hiding corruption. Congregations cried for moral order, yet reveled in gossip. The louder a man proclaimed his holiness, the more likely someone whispered about his sins. Hypocrisy became the colony's most accepted secret, the invisible glue holding a trembling society together. Church attendance was near mandatory, but faith was often performance. Families dressed in their finest sat through endless sermons and nodded solemnly as ministers condemned vanity and greed, only to discuss land deals and scandals over supper. Sunday was for repentance, Monday for rumor. Even the sermons themselves became political tools, crafted to flatter wealthy patrons or attack rivals under the guise of divine inspiration. Colonial diaries reveal how deeply this hypocrisy was woven into daily life. Women wrote of preachers who scolded them for pride while demanding private visits. Men confessed to manipulating scripture for profit. One Boston merchant admitted attending church for business more than belief. Since most contracts were sealed with a handshake after service, the church was not only a sanctuary of souls, it was the stock exchange of reputation. The hypocrisy extended beyond individuals. Entire congregations played at righteousness while protecting their own scandals. When a prominent elder's son was caught in adultery, the matter was quietly handled. But if a servant girl was accused, her punishment was swift and public. Double standards were justified through scripture, twisted to preserve the hierarchy of gender and class. Sin was not measured by its nature, but by who committed it. Ministers, once the unquestioned moral beacons of the colonies, began to lose their aura of divine authority. Too many had been caught in contradictions, preaching against temptation while secretly indulging in it. The pulpit, once feared, became a stage for skepticism. Parishioners whispered during sermons, wondering whether their preacher's tears were genuine or rehearsed. This slow erosion of trust planted the seeds of a new kind of faith, one that would rise later with the Great Awakening. People began to crave sincerity over ceremony, grace over judgment. But in this moment, the colonies remained trapped in their own theater of virtue. They sang hymns of repentance with lips that lied and prayed to a God who by now must have learned to ignore their hypocrisy. By the 1730s, the colonies had grown weary of hollow sermons and moral masquerades. The hypocrisy of old churches had drained faith of its fire. Then came the Great Awakening, a storm of revival that swept through towns like wildfire, promising rebirth and truth. Traveling preachers thundered across fields and meeting houses, urging colonists to abandon pretense and face their sins directly. For the first time, religion became emotional, raw, and personal. Men like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards shattered the calm of traditional worship. Their voices rose not from pulpits of polished wood, but from the open air, where thousands wept and shouted under the sky. Edwards' famous sermon, "Sinners in the hands of an angry God," painted salvation as a trembling thread over the fires of hell. Fear, passion, and repentance mingled until faith felt alive again. But this awakening was not only spiritual, it was social rebellion. The movement challenged the established clergy, exposing their greed and moral failures. Ordinary people no longer needed permission from ministers to speak with God. Women servants, and even enslaved Africans found their voices in revival meetings, proclaiming visions, dreams, and divine callings. The Great Awakening gave power to the very people colonial religion had long silenced. Established churches panicked. Ministers denounced revivalists as fanatics, accusing them of spreading hysteria. Pamphlets flew like arrows, sermons mocking other sermons, accusations of false prophecy and sexual immorality. The revival that promised purity instead revealed the rot beneath the system. When revivalists wept openly for grace, traditional clergy sneered that such displays were immodest. But behind that contempt was fear. Fear of losing control over the pulpit and the purse. Scandals multiplied as preachers who claimed divine revelation fell into the same traps as their predecessors. Charismatic revivalists were caught in affairs, misusing donations, or preaching apocalyptic visions for profit. The public, once moved to tears, began to question whether any man of God could truly be trusted. Yet, for all its chaos, the Great Awakening tore away religion's mask. It revealed faith as both fragile and powerful, a force that could inspire redemption or ignite madness. In trying to cleanse the colonies, revivalists succeeded in doing something far more dangerous. They made the people see that sin didn't live in the wilderness or the witch, but within every beating heart, including their own. As the colonies marched toward revolution, the moral storms of the past century left behind a permanent mark. Religion had started as a refuge, a place for salvation in a wild and uncertain world. But by the mid-1700s, it had become both sword and shield. Ministers invoked scripture to bless rebellion, just as their predecessors had used it to justify obedience. Churches that once condemned dissent now preached liberty from the same pulpits where witches had once been cursed. Faith had learned to change its face with the times, and scandal remained its shadow. The lines between politics, morality, and divine were blurred completely. Preachers used sermons to rally militias, comparing King George to Pharaoh and the colonies to the Israelites. Congregations cheered, forgetting how only decades earlier, similar sermons had condemned rebellion as satanic pride. The hypocrisy that once poisoned the church now fueled revolution. America's hunger for freedom was in part born from centuries of spiritual control. The people had grown tired of confessing to men who sinned just as they did. Yet even in this age of awakening, the old habits persisted. Ministers accused rivals of secret loyalism, and political opponents were labeled enemies of God. Moral virtue became a weapon once again, this time to prove one's patriotism. To be godly was to be loyal. To doubt was to risk exile. The colonies had traded one kind of tyranny for another, cloaked now in divine rhetoric. But the legacy of scandal never truly vanished. It transformed. Instead of witch hunts and public whippings, there were pamphlet wars and whispered accusations of infidelity or heresy. Faith continued to police the soul, only now through reputation rather than law. The pulpit's power shifted, but it did not fade. In the end, colonial America's greatest sin was not adultery, blasphemy, or greed. It was the belief that faith and power could coexist without corruption. Every sermon, every scandal, every confession had proven otherwise. The colonies entered independence with churches still divided, ministers still flawed, and believers still human, forever caught between salvation and shame. And so, the story of religion in early America closed as it began. Not with purity, but with the uneasy truth that the same faith that built a nation also nearly damned it. In the 1630s, the Massachusetts Bay Colony stood as the shining example of Puritan ambition. A model Christian commonwealth governed by scripture and strict discipline, its founders believed they were building God's earthly kingdom, a city upon a hill for all the world to admire. Yet beneath that vision of unity, cracks had already begun to form. The colony was prosperous. Yes, its towns growing, its churches multiplying, but its government was suffocating. Political power rested in the hands of a small circle of magistrates and ministers who claimed to speak for God. For ordinary settlers, it felt less like a holy refuge and more like a sanctified cage. Among the restless was a man named Thomas Hooker, a respected minister and scholar from Chelmsford, England. Hooker had fled persecution in his homeland, hoping to find spiritual freedom in the New World. But what he discovered in Massachusetts was not freedom at all. The Puritan leaders, led by Governor John Winthrop, insisted that only full church members could vote or hold office. Salvation, they believed, gave a man not just a soul, but a voice. Hooker, however, saw danger in that union of faith and authority. He believed government should rest on the consent of the governed, not merely on the approval of the elect. Hooker's sermons began to stir unease. He preached that God's grace did not make men superior in earthly matters, and that every free man should have a say in how he was governed. To some, his words were heresy. To others, they were liberation. The colony's elders feared Hooker's ideas would unravel their fragile theocracy. A minister questioning the link between salvation and power was more than a theological nuisance. It was a political threat. By 1635, tensions between Hooker and Massachusetts authorities had reached their breaking point. The debates grew heated, the sermons sharper. Hooker's followers, farmers, craftsmen, and settlers, tired of rigid rule, began to dream of a new beginning. They no longer wished to live under men who equated dissent with sin. And so, beneath the banners of faith, the seeds of rebellion were quietly sown. Hooker would not stay to reform Massachusetts from within. He would build something new beyond its borders. A colony where church and government could exist without suffocating one another, a vision that would soon reshape American democracy. In the spring of 1636, Thomas Hooker gathered his congregation in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and made an announcement that sent ripples through the colony. They were leaving, Not for England, not for another established town, but for the wild, untamed lands to the west, beyond the control of the Massachusetts General Court. To most Puritan leaders, it sounded like madness. To Hooker and his followers, it was a pilgrimage, not of exile, but of conviction. The decision was both theological and political. Hooker believed that Massachusetts had betrayed the very ideals it claimed to protect. The colony's leaders had built a system that preached equality before God, but practiced elitism in government only. The visible saints, those deemed saved, had the right to vote or participate in political life. To Hooker, this was tyranny disguised as holiness. He declared that the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people. It was a radical notion, centuries ahead of its time. Here is the script with punctuation added, without changing any words, and one that could not survive under Winthrop's rule. In June of that year, Hooker led around 100 men, women, and children, his entire congregation, on a grueling trek through the New England wilderness. They packed ox carts with what little they could carry, seeds, tools, Bibles, and the unshakable belief that God had called them to something greater. For 2 weeks they trudged westward through forests thick with mosquitoes, across rivers swollen with spring rain. There were no roads, no inns, only faith and endurance. Accounts from the journey tell of exhaustion and hunger, yet also of unity. At night, the settlers camped beneath the stars, singing hymns and praying for strength. Hooker, already in his 50s and ailing, rode on horseback at the front, his resolve unbroken. He told his followers that hardship was proof of divine favor, that their struggle was the price of liberty. When they finally reached the fertile valley of the Connecticut River, the wilderness must have seemed like paradise. Rich soil, fresh water, and open land stretched in every direction. Here, far from the shadow of Boston's steeples, they would plant both crops and ideals. The settlement they found at Hartford was not just a refuge. It was a declaration that freedom, even when born of faith, must be chosen, not imposed. The Connecticut River Valley was more than a new home. It was a blank slate. For Thomas Hooker and his followers, the settlement they began in 1636 was a test of faith and principle. They called it Hartford, after Hooker's parish in England, but its foundation was not built on nostalgia. It was built on rebellion. Quiet, moral rebellion against Massachusetts' rigid hierarchy. From the start, Hartford's settlers made one thing clear. This would not be another theocracy disguised as democracy. In Massachusetts, ministers and magistrates worked hand in hand, declaring that divine election determined political worth. In Connecticut, Hooker and his followers sought a government rooted in community consent rather than church privilege. Though Puritan in spirit, they rejected the notion that salvation should determine citizenship. Every man, so long as he was part of the community and under its laws, deserved a voice. Daily life in Hartford was harsh, but filled with purpose. Settlers cleared forests, built simple meeting houses, and tilled the fertile soil that would soon make the colony self-sufficient. Winters were brutal. Wolves howled through the night, and hunger sometimes gnawed at the edges of faith. Yet the settlers' conviction never faltered. They believed that their hardship was sanctified by a divine mission to prove that order could exist without tyranny. Hooker's presence loomed over the colony like a moral compass. Though soft-spoken, he was unyielding in his belief that governance should arise from the consent of the governed. His sermons echoed through Hartford's crude wooden church, declaring that, in matters which concern the common good, all have equal right to give their voice. To a people accustomed to being ruled by distant ministers, his words were electrifying. But their bold experiment did not go unnoticed. Back in Boston, Winthrop and the Massachusetts leadership regarded Connecticut's independence as dangerous. To them, Hooker's settlement was a spiritual contagion, a challenge to the divine order. Yet Hartford's success proved undeniable. The crops thrived, trade grew, and neighboring settlements, Wethersfield and Windsor, soon joined them in forming a regional alliance. In a few short years, what began as an exodus of dissenters had transformed into a thriving colony of conscience. Hooker's rebellion was no longer a whisper in the wilderness. It was a living, breathing society, one that dared to define freedom on its own terms. By 1639, the settlements along the Connecticut River, Hartford, Windsor and Wethersfield had grown strong enough to face a defining question. How should they govern themselves? They had fled Massachusetts to escape rigid rule, but independence alone was not enough. Without laws, even freedom could descend into chaos. Thomas Hooker, though weary from age and illness, guided the colony toward an answer, an experiment in government that would echo through history. The result was the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, adopted in January 1639. To later generations, it would be known as the first written constitution in the Western world. But to its creators, it was a covenant, a sacred contract among equals. Unlike Massachusetts, where citizenship and voting were bound to church membership, the Fundamental Orders declared that political authority came from the free consent of the people. Government was not divine privilege, but a human trust. The document laid out a framework for self-rule, called for an elected governor, magistrates, and a general court chosen by freemen, not ordained ministers or church elders. Laws would be created by those accountable to the governed. It was a modest charter by appearance, yet revolutionary in principle. For the first time in the New World, a government claimed its legitimacy from the people rather than from God's supposed representatives. Hooker's influence was unmistakable. Though not the author of the orders, his sermons had planted their philosophical roots. Years earlier, he had preached that the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people. Now, those words had become law. This simple yet radical notion that government derives power from the governed would one day form the backbone of the United States Constitution. For Hooker's followers, the adoption of the orders marked a triumph of faith through reason. They believed they had honored God by granting liberty, not by hoarding it. The colony celebrated with prayers, thanksgiving, and a renewed sense of divine mission. But their boldness carried risks. To Massachusetts, Connecticut's new government looked dangerously democratic, a spiritual and political revolt. Still, Hooker's settlers held their ground. In the silence of the frozen Connecticut River Valley, a revolution had begun, one not fought with muskets, but with principles inked on parchment and sealed by conviction. Connecticut's quiet revolution did not go unnoticed. To Massachusetts Bay's leadership, Hooker's colony was not a sister settlement. It was a rogue state. The idea that men could govern themselves without church oversight was more than heresy. It was political contagion. The Massachusetts magistrates feared that if Hooker's doctrine spread, their own authority, wrapped in divine justification, would crumble. And so began a cold war of words, theology, and pride. At first, the tension was cloaked in diplomacy. Massachusetts sent letters questioning Connecticut's right to establish an independent government without permission from the original royal charter. They reminded Hooker and his allies that the land along the Connecticut River had once been claimed by Massachusetts traders. Beneath the polite language ran a clear threat: submit to Boston's authority, or face legal and spiritual consequences. Hooker responded, not with defiance, but with scripture. In his sermons, he reminded his congregation that even Moses had sought counsel from the people before leading them through the wilderness. Authority, he argued, must serve the governed, not rule them. Word spread quickly, copied by hand and carried from village to village. For many colonists across New England, Hooker's defiance gave voice to something they had long felt but dared not say, that holiness and hierarchy were not the same thing. Massachusetts ministers countered by labeling Hooker's colony a breeding ground for error and disorder. Some accused him of sowing the seeds of anarchy. Others hinted that such democratic notions would invite divine wrath. Yet Hooker's followers remained steadfast. They refused to attend Massachusetts synods, refused to tithe to Boston churches, and even refused to obey colonial summons. For a people raised to obey authority as a sacred duty, such resistance was nothing short of revolutionary. The dispute soon spilled into the courts. Massachusetts tried to reclaim the river towns through royal charters and trade restrictions, but Connecticut held firm. Backed by their alliances with local native tribes and their growing prosperity, the settlers stood their ground. In the end, Massachusetts realized that force would only divide the Puritan cause. Hooker had won not through rebellion or blood, but through conviction. Connecticut remained independent, a living argument that moral authority did not require Massachusetts's blessing, only the courage to stand apart from it. Freedom came at a price. The Connecticut settlers, though spiritually and politically independent, were surrounded by challenges that tested their resolve far more than theological debates ever could. The Connecticut River Valley was fertile, but it was also contested land, home to powerful native tribes like the Pequot and the Mohegan, and coveted by Dutch traders from New Netherland. Hooker's followers had left Massachusetts to build a godly republic, but they soon found themselves fighting for sheer survival. The most immediate threat came from the Pequot tribe, who controlled much of the fur trade in the region. Tensions between the Pequots, the English, and their rival tribes had simmered for years, but in 1637 they exploded into open war, known as the Pequot War. It became one of the bloodiest conflicts in early colonial America. Connecticut's towns, Hartford, Wethersfield, and Windsor, were still young and vulnerable, their defenses weak. But under Captain John Mason, the settlers struck with brutal precision. In a dawn assault on the Pequot stronghold at Mystic, the colonists and their native allies set fire to the village, killing hundreds. The massacre stunned even the Puritans themselves. They called it divine judgment, a victory granted by God. But privately, some wondered if their new society had already stained itself with blood. Hooker, though not a soldier, prayed publicly for forgiveness and peace. The war had secured Connecticut's safety, but it had also awakened the colony to the moral cost of conquest. Beyond warfare, frontier life tested the settlers' endurance daily. Winters were punishing. Disease swept through settlements with merciless speed. Wolves and hunger haunted the nights. Yet the same people who had challenged Boston's spiritual tyranny refused to surrender to nature's. They built mills along the river, schools for their children, and meeting houses that doubled as fortresses. Every Sunday, Hooker's sermons reminded them that adversity was proof of divine favor, that God refined his chosen people through trial, not comfort. By the early 1640s, Connecticut had survived famine, war, and political isolation. What began as a daring exodus had matured into a resilient society. But the colony's identity, independent, defiant, and morally self-assured, was being forged not just in faith or law, but in fire. The wilderness had tested them, and they had learned to thrive in it. By the early 1640s, Connecticut had emerged from its dangerous infancy, no longer a fragile outpost, but a functioning colony bound by shared ideals. The settlers who had trudged through the wilderness with Thomas Hooker now faced the harder task of building permanence: law, education, trade, and diplomacy. If Massachusetts had been the model of rigid theocracy, Connecticut would prove that a godly people could govern themselves without tyranny. At the center of this vision was community. Each town, Hartford, Windsor, and Wethers, felt prated as a small republic, holding regular town meetings where freemen debated taxes, land disputes, and defense. These meetings were lively affairs, full of argument and scripture in equal measure. Ordinary farmers spoke alongside magistrates, and decisions were made by vote, not decree. For the first time in the English colonies, democracy was not an abstract theory, it was daily life. Hooker encouraged literacy and learning, believing that a self-governing people must also be an educated one. The colony established schools, ensured children could read the Bible, and invited ministers to teach not just theology, but moral reasoning. In Hartford, Hooker's church became a center of debate, the crucible of ideas that would later shape the American conscience. He who governs himself, Hooker once said, need not fear the rule of another. It became a quiet creed for generations to come. Economically, the colony prospered. The fertile Connecticut River Valley produced abundant crops, and trade flourished with neighboring colonies and native tribes. Ships carried lumber, grain, and furs downriver to Long Island Sound, linking Hartford to the wider Atlantic world. But even in success, Connecticut maintained its humility. Wealth, Hooker warned, was a fleeting grace if not anchored in godliness. Prosperity, he insisted, must serve virtue, not replace it. Still, challenges lingered. Religious disputes occasionally flared, and questions about authority tested the fragile balance between freedom and order. Yet compared to the iron grip of Massachusetts, Connecticut's governance was remarkably tolerant. Dissent was not celebrated, but it was rarely crushed. In this delicate balance between faith and freedom, law and conscience, Connecticut found its strength. It was a society built not on fear of sin, but on trust in the moral capacity of man. Against all odds, Hooker's dream had taken root, a new order in a wild land, governed not by decree but by conviction. While Connecticut's settlers built their democratic haven in the wilderness, a shadow loomed across the Atlantic. England, the mother country they had fled, was unraveling. By the 1640s, civil war had broken out between King Charles I and Parliament. Across the colonies, loyalties divided. Some still prayed for the king. Others saw his downfall as divine justice. For Connecticut, the conflict was both distant and deeply personal. For their entire existence had been a quiet argument against monarchy. Hooker's teachings suddenly seemed prophetic. His claim that authority must rest on the consent of the governed now echoed the very arguments used by Parliament against the king. In London, such words were treason. In Hartford, they were gospel. Connecticut's settlers watched events unfold with grim fascination: the beheading of a monarch, the rise of Oliver Cromwell, and the dream of a republic in England itself. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the ideals born in the New World were being tested in the Old. But this turmoil also brought danger. Royal power in America had grown weak, and England's colonial charters fell into confusion. Massachusetts used the chaos to expand its territorial claims, insisting that Connecticut had no right to self-rule without a royal patent. The dispute revived old tensions, and for a time it seemed possible that Hooker's colony might once again face political absorption by its Puritan rival. Connecticut's leaders responded with diplomacy rather than defiance. They sent envoys to England to plead their case before Parliament and later before Cromwell's government. Their message was simple: Connecticut was loyal to England, but ruled by the consent of its people. Cromwell, sympathetic to Puritan independence, left them in peace. But the experience taught the colony a valuable lesson: that liberty unguarded could vanish with the stroke of a pen. Throughout this period, Thomas Hooker remained a moral anchor. Though his health was failing, he preached unity and vigilance, warning that freedom was fragile and must be defended not by swords, but by steadfast faith. His colony, he said, must serve as a candle set upon a hill, lighting the way for all who sought righteousness and reason together. As England burned in civil war, Connecticut stood steady, small, defiant, and sure of its purpose, to prove that government by conscience could outlast government by crown. By the time Thomas Hooker died in 1647, his body had grown frail, but his ideas had already taken root in a new world. The man who once walked through the wilderness at the head of weary settlers left behind something far greater than a town. He left the first blueprint for democracy on American soil. His name might never have carried the fame of Winthrop or Bradford, but his vision quietly shaped the moral architecture of a nation yet to be born. Hooker's final years were spent in Hartford, where he continued to preach and guide his flock through disease, famine, and the lingering fears of Indian attack. Yet even in hardship, he refused to bend to despair. His sermons grew softer, but sharper in meaning, emphasizing mercy over judgment, equality over privilege. When other Puritan leaders obsessed over sin, Hooker preached about conscience, the divine voice within every man. He told his people that true authority was not granted by ministers or monarchs, but by God speaking through the collective wisdom of the people themselves. After his death, his followers carried that torch forward. The fundamental orders remained the foundation of Connecticut's government, a living testament to his principles. Even critics in Massachusetts grudgingly admitted that Hooker's colony had achieved something remarkable: stability without tyranny. Generations later, his words would echo in the rhetoric of the American Revolution. When patriots declared that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, those phrases, often attributed to Enlightenment thinkers, were born in the pulpit of a Puritan preacher on the edge of the wilderness. Hooker's influence outlived the theocracy he challenged, while Massachusetts clung to its narrow orthodoxy. Connecticut's more inclusive system attracted settlers from across New England. The colony thrived in peace and prosperity, its people proud of a government that balanced liberty with law. Even when royal charters and governors later tried to assert control, Connecticut's democratic habits proved impossible to uproot. In the grand story of America, Hooker's march to the Connecticut River was more than a migration. It was a statement of faith in humanity's moral capacity. His colony stood as proof that conscience, not coercion, could bind a people together. And in that truth lay the seed of a future republic.